this, the whole event will be split into the 3 sessions, one dedicated to social protection, another to inclusive education, and the third one to health. If you would like to ask a question to the presenters, you can use comment box, and we will try our best to go through your questions at the end of the presentations. Without further ado, we can start with the first session, and I will pass over to Jose Vieira from the World Blind Union to guide us through the session on the social protection. Jose, please.
Thank you, Vladimir. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And as Vladimir has mentioned, our first session today is about social protection. We all know that COVID-19 crisis has significantly impacted the life of people with disabilities living around the world, and with particular focus on different elements of social protection systems in different countries. Realities are different. Countries and public administrations have managed the crisis differently, but certainly we can say that people with disabilities are being one of the most affected by the different consequences of the pandemic. In this session, we will invite Mr. Alex Cote, social protection expert and also the coordinator of an international project on social protection co-developed by ILO and UNICEF and the UNPRPD, to tell us more about what it means, social protection for people with disabilities in general, and what are perhaps lessons that we have to learn and challenges that we will all face as a community in terms of social protection with people with disabilities. So with no further ado, and hoping to that everybody will learn more about social protection and can share your views and experience in the next 15 minutes, I will invite Mr. Alex Cote to give us a 10 minutes presentation, and then we can just open the floor for questions and answer. Alex, welcome. Thank you for your time. And please, if you can tell us about the different challenges about social protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose, and thanks to all of you for joining us. So one of the key instruments of government in the response to COVID-19 is social protection. And we would like to share with you few elements regarding to social protection systems and the big lesson learned we have from the COVID-19. Next. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's very important from the start is to understand what social protection are supposed to do for persons with disabilities. And there are 4 major functions that we are expecting. Is basically basic income security for people with disability who may not have the opportunity to work, access to healthcare and coverage of healthcare related costs, including rehabilitation and assistive device, coverage of disability related costs, including access to support services, and last, facilitating access to other services like education or economic empowerment program. One of the big elements that is often neglected in social protection system, mostly in low and middle income countries, it's accounting for the disability related costs that persons with disability face. Very often, social protection are provided on the basis of means test or assessment of the household expenditures, which rarely take into consideration the fact that persons with disabilities and their families have to pay for assistive device, additional medical supplies, might need to take taxi because public transportation is not accessible, and may require support like personal assistance. A key issue also that is rarely taken into account is the fact that families of persons with disabilities and households in general and across the continuum of consumption in the population tend to earn much less than the similar household without person with disabilities. So the instruments that are in place in different countries includes disability pension, disability allowance, concession, for instance, like tax deduction. More and more countries are providing a universal healthcare package that includes some element of assistive device or rehabilitation, but it's still very narrow. I just would like to ask the colleagues if we can move with the PowerPoint presentation, because I would like to show some graph. No? Okay. So some key message I wanted to share with you with regards to the situation pre-COVID. If we have a nearly universal coverage by social protection system in high-income countries, it's far from being the case in low and middle-income countries. Actually, less than 20% of people with significant disabilities receive disability-related benefits in low and middle-income countries, and it goes down to 1% in low-income countries. And we really saw that in the first months of the COVID-19 crisis, where countries actually do not have the system in place to support persons with disability. And it relates also to the low level of investment pre-COVID-19, where in the OECD countries, we have in average 1.4% of the GDP spending on social protection for persons with disabilities, where only 6 low and middle income countries are spending more than 0.3% of the GDP. 2 weeks ago, we issued a first overview of the response, social protection response specific for persons with disabilities that have been, measures that have been taken since the beginning of the crisis. Over 180 countries that have announced social protection measures, 30% have included specific reference to persons with disabilities. So this is not to say that there is only 60 countries where persons with disabilities are supported by social protection, because if you do, for instance, food distribution to the generic population, you may include also household where there are persons with disabilities. But we have looked at measures that have been taken specifically to address persons with disability issues. So over the 60 countries that have taken specific measures, there are, of course, the first one is cash transfer. And you have several countries who have advance payment of disability benefit, provided top-up and extra payment, or for instance, have relaxed eligibility criteria. Sri Lanka, for instance, included all the people that were on waiting lists for disability allowance. They included it all at once. And Senegal, for instance, took all the people that were in the disability card registry, including them in their social registry, which is used to target household for food distribution in the crisis. Another element that have been taken by government, mostly in countries where there is social insurance, is to extend paid leave for parents of children with disabilities that have to stop working to provide care and support. So that was that's a measure that has been quite frequent in the countries where there is social insurance. In countries that have support services, some measures have been taken, for instance, to ensure that services will be delivered at home. but we can see again that there is, it was difficult in high income countries. There has been significant disruption, and it has been even more difficult in low and middle income countries where the structure of publicly funded support services is not, it's not that strong. So that was, that remained an issue. Another measures that have been taken was, for instance, preventing contamination of persons with disability while using the social protection systems. So there has been, in some countries, home delivery of cash benefit, but also home delivery of food and non-food essential items using the disability registries. So that has been also something that has been done. Few countries have also developed specific helpline for persons with disabilities and their families, helping them navigating the disruption and the closure of services, and trying to identify who could be the service provider that can provide help during the crisis and the lockdown. South Africa, in the other hand, for instance, made exemption during lockdown for taxis. If you have the disability card, you can use a taxi during forbidden hours in the lockdown because South Africa recognized the fact that persons with disabilities might need to go for rehabilitation services or health, and wants to facilitate their movement in the lockdown. So projecting ourselves with regards to the recovery, what did we learn? Is the fact that countries who already have a good national registry, that have a disability allowance, and that have support services that are publicly funded, have been in a much better position to respond. And if we know that persons with disability are more likely to lose their job in an economic crisis and will have more difficulty to find a new job in the recovery, while there is a lot of effort that needs to be put on making economic recovery program inclusive, extending social protection is absolutely paramount. Otherwise, inequality that were already existing before the COVID-19 crisis will actually expand and will be magnified over the long term. So several countries are considering now creating disability support allowance for persons with disabilities, children with disabilities. It's very important also to consider cash plus service programs to ensure that people with disabilities access the support services they need, including to find and keep work. And maybe a last point, it's preventing austerity measures. We know that many countries have spent a lot and are spending a lot in the crisis right now, and they will face issue of fiscal consolidation. We have seen in Europe in the last decade the very negative impact of austerity measures and budget cuts in social protection for persons with disabilities. And we really hope that lessons have been learned and this will not happen again in the aftermath of the crisis, and that the recovery at the opposite will be an opportunity in many low and middle income countries to increase their investment on inclusion of persons with disabilities. A last point, and we could come back to that with regards to questions. We are launching with the University of Bonn a training on social protection and inclusion of persons with disabilities. It will be July, August, and September, and it's meant for DPOs and government representatives that are interested in developing social protection systems in an inclusive way for persons with disabilities. Thank you very much. Jose?
Thank you, Alex, for your great presentation. For participants, now it's time for you to ask questions. We already have received a few questions, but if you want to ask more questions, you can use the comment box on the platform to share your comments or questions. Alex, we do have one first question. When you were talking about the different targeted populations that are receiving or should receive this social protection benefits, a question is, do we know any good practice or any documented practice around refugees with disabilities who are waiting for be eligible for this type of benefits? That's the first question.
Yeah, actually, outside of pure humanitarian intervention, which would be under the UN agencies, we are not really aware of countries that have, during COVID-19, take specific measures to support refugees with disabilities. And I think it's not to say that it didn't happen. Huh? It's just that the information has not come to us yet. I know that there are different data collection ongoing with regards to this specific topic. So we could follow up with the person or with people that have asked the question with regards to that. I would just highlight that some countries in which we have been in contact in the recent weeks, I would say persons with disabilities that are citizens or legal residents of countries already do not, in most countries, they do not receive support from the social protection systems. So that I think is, I think it relativizes what we can expect from social protection systems today with regards to support to refugees with disability, unfortunately. But we need to collect more information with regards to that point.
Thank you, Alex. We do have another question, and that is regarding disability cards. You mentioned some cases where disability registry and disability card have played a significant role in supporting people with disabilities in accessing social protection system and also other type of services like the one that you explained about South Africa. What is your recommendation, or what is your view around not only the COVID-19 response, but beyond that and looking into the future sort of social economic responses around COVID-19, the importance of disability cards, disability registry, and social protection systems?
Thank you very much. This is an absolutely critical question, and we know there are a lot of debates around disability card itself. I think we advocated for development of such national disability registry before the crisis, and the crisis really showed how important they are. I think the main debate is not so much should we have a disability registry. It's the main question is what are those disability registry? And for instance, if you build your disability assessment and determination solely, for instance, on the type of disability, are you a blind person, are you a deaf person? And if you don't have any other information, actually disability registry have a very little added value. They have little added value. What we are recommending is to have national disability registry that are really built on disability assessment that would focus on the support requirement of persons with disabilities. You want to know in the population who needs personal assistance, who needs sign language, who need assistive device. And I would put you in a great position when in regular situation to build your social protection system and your support services. But when the crisis hits, whether it's a cyclone or a pandemic, you will be in a much better position to provide this support. Another element that is extremely important is that having good disability registry can really help you cost and plan your budget over years. Because you already have, with this registry, the people that are likely to be eligible to new services and programs that you would create. So it creates a good factor of anticipation for Ministry of Social Affairs or Ministry of Finance in anticipating what would be the fiscal impact of services that are needed and how you would progressively roll them out. Maybe one thing that can help also is the words. Maybe we don't want disability card. Maybe we want equal opportunity card like in Senegal, or inclusion card, or solidarity card like they exist in different countries where maybe the stigma is not so strong. For instance, in Senegal, the DPOs were saying, we don't want a disability card because we are disabled. We want a disability, we want an equal opportunity card because we have the right to equal opportunities. And this card should be a tool to help us equalize opportunity. I think this can help also within the disability movement and government to have a good perspective on why you want to develop those registries. But absolutely, they are critical, and they need to be connected to national registry, over national registry. So there is also discussion now in interoperability of those different databases, but it's definitely a priority.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for your clarity in the answer, but for sort of connecting this issue to some other critical elements of the whole discussion around social protection. Like, for example, how do we determine the cost of such programs, and how we determine eligibility criteria for people with disabilities when accessing these type of services. My next question to you, Alex, is about what happened with persons with disabilities in the informal sector, because the informal sector of the economy, but also in the informal sector of the labor market, because all these services, all these systems that we are talking about pre-assume that are mainly oriented for people with disabilities that are registered, that are part of the formal sectors of the economy. So what is your view? What is your opinion or recommendations around how to deal with those people with disabilities who are part of the informal sectors and they need these services or even more than other groups? Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. This is indeed a critical element of the economic recovery. The tools that government may have with regards to disability employment, like quota, tax incentives, social clause in public procurement, can be effective with the formal sector, but they might not be very effective in the informal sector. And this is really an important element, is that when you support in the formal sector, you can channel fund through the companies via different mechanisms. But if you want to support people in the informal sector, you cannot do that because companies are not registered. And especially we know that many people with disability, most people are working in the informal sector, and many are self-employed. So having, for instance, a disability support allowance to cover the disability related cost that is compatible with work, and that can be an excellent tool for a person with disabilities. This is the case, for instance, in Fiji or in Thailand or Mauritius, where the disability allowance is not granted to people on the condition or the criteria of incapacity to work, but on the criteria of support requirement, which means that I am a person with disability, I want to go to work, I want to go to the market to sell the product that I produced at home. I cannot take the bus. I need to take a private transportation because buses are not accessible. If I have my disability support allowance, I can pay for this bus, which means it doesn't impact my profit. It makes it profitable for me to go to the market and sell my products. And those are really measures or perspective that governments really need to have, is that social protection can help socioeconomic inclusion of persons with disabilities. And if you, for instance, develop disability benefits that are solely attached to incapacity to work, what you do is actually, you do the opposite. You undermine socioeconomic inclusion. And I think more and more countries are starting to really think that way. It's not easy, it's a challenge, but definitely if you want to support people with disability in the informal sector, a disability support allowance that is universal and that is compatible with work would be probably one of the best way to achieve that in the short and mid-term. There are other measures, of course, with regards to microfinance and support to self-employment, but none of those would tackle those issues of disability-related cost.
Thank you, Alex. And thanks to all the participants. We are getting a lot of questions. Alex, there is a clear, I would say, need of going into more details about disability cards and disability registries. We are getting a lot of questions around that. So perhaps we can think of another opportunity to discuss more in details about disability cards and registries.
Actually, maybe, Jose, just for that, in the frame of the UNPRPD program, we are developing a set of thematic papers in the coming 2 months to answer some of those questions and to expand the debate. And there will be specific webinar along that, so we can keep all the participants to this webinar informed if they want to join. Thanks.
That's an excellent idea, Alex. We will ensure that we let all the participants know about this upcoming webinars on these specific areas. Alex, I do have a final question. We just have a few minutes left before we move on to the next session. I just want to get your reflection around something that you mentioned during your presentation, and that is austerity measures and budget cuts. We are all aware that will be a big challenge for everyone to manage this crisis and to explore recovery options with the current economic situation. What are some of the ideas, what are some of the tips, if may I say, that you can share with the participant in sort of dealing with this austerity measures and people with disabilities, social protection, and how to ensure that we do not make any decision that is against people with disability full inclusion? It's definitely a very complicated question, and I'm sure there is no only one right answer, but if you can just give us some general reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, I think this is a quite complex issue. And I think it's very context dependent also. I think the debate in high income countries is not the same than in low and middle income countries. I think in high income countries, what we've learned from the last decade is that austerity measures cost money. They cost a lot of money. And countries like the UK, who had severe reform of their social welfare system with regards to disability, I don't think that at the end of the day, they saved a lot of money. And it cost a lot. It had profound impact on persons with disabilities. And I think this overall cost that you need to take into consideration. With regards to low and middle income countries, I think it's safe to say that most countries are spending less than 0.1% of the GDP on support to persons with disabilities. So I think there is not much to cut. And at the end, at the opposite, I think in order to really have a positive impact, the investment on inclusion of persons with disabilities can provide greater support. When you know that actually 25% of households in a country, 20 to 25% of households have persons with disability in their families, you can, if you invest on inclusion of persons with disabilities, you can actually provide support and relief to a quarter of your population. So I think those are elements that are really important to take into consideration. And I think a last point maybe is there are measures, for instance, social clause for employment of persons with disabilities in public procurement can generate support for employment of persons with disabilities at nearly no cost for government. And I think it's also how we make the most use of all the instruments and programs we have that can be helpful. Another element, for instance, many countries have public works program. It could be interesting to explore how we can use those public works program to provide, for instance, income to parents of children with disabilities who have stopped working to provide support and care for their children with disabilities. And this has been insufficiently explored. And again, this is a measure that would have a very marginal cost for the program and can have tremendous impact for children with disabilities and their families. So I think there is also, it's not only a question of spending more, but it's also how to make the most of the services and the spendings you are already doing. And I think in that space, there is a lot of innovation that we need to put in place to make the most of flagship programs that mobilize a lot of resource at country levels and that are too often not designed in an inclusive manner and not designed to really support inclusion of persons with disabilities.
Alex, thank you very much for your presentation. I will just conclude by just saying two things that I would like to highlight from your presentation. You mentioned that 0.1% of GDP has been allocated to support services for persons with disabilities. Definitely we need to increase that. But also you mentioned something that is very important, and that is how to make the existing programs inclusive of persons with disabilities. If somehow we can align an increased budget allocation towards support services for persons with disabilities, and we ensure that what is existing already is disability inclusive, the opportunities of persons with disabilities in accessing to social protection services and other support services will definitely increase. Thank you for your always clear explanation and for making complicated things to be understood easily. Thank you very much. We will definitely keep an eye for getting those new webinars when they come and when they are available. And thanks for your time today with us. So over to you, Vladimir. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jose, and thank you very much, Alex. Really, this was a great presentation, especially needed in the current time when we are faced with so much uncertainty. I think social protection is playing and will play one of the most significant role in the inclusion of persons with disabilities in time of COVID and post-COVID. And really, we need to look at how we can use knowledge that we can generate through these webinars to improve social protection schemes, and how we can indeed build back better, what they say, but let's really make it so. And if countries would like to cutting from 0.01 is really very hard. So maybe it should not be cut there. I also believe that what was discussed about how the programs that exist can become more disability inclusive, it's something that is very critical. So thank you very much. This was very informative session. I would like to remind you to respond to the poll that are showing on your screens. I think that was shown during the presentation itself. Thank you for that. Without further ado, let's move to the session number 2, and I give the floor to Diane Richler from Inclusion International and chairperson for Catalyst for Inclusive Education, who will guide us through the next session on inclusive education. And I hope that this time we will have better luck with PowerPoint presentations.
Thank you, Vladimir, and it looks good already. So thank you. I think this is a good segue from the presentation that Alex did. And I think the situation with education is a little bit different because the guidelines related to the CRPD for education of persons with disabilities is so much clearer than what the provisions are for social protection. So can I have the next slide, please? It looked like we were going to start. Okay, if I could get the next slide as soon as possible, which is just to explain what our agenda is, which is just a very brief introduction on how, thank you, how education systems can comply with the CRPD. But then the main focus, which will be presented by Asma, is on addressing barriers to education for children with disabilities. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. I don't think that I need to tell this audience who the children are with disabilities, but we've put a couple of slides in so that if you want to share this presentation with others who couldn't participate, there will be some background that, that you'll be able to rely on. I think what's important to remember, though, is just the numbers of children with disabilities. Estimations, 1 in 10 children. And we know that children with disabilities are among the most excluded from education even before the pandemic. And certainly the pandemic has made their situation even more precarious. In good times, at least half of children with disabilities, particularly in low-income countries, are out of school. But even in middle and high-income countries, many children with disabilities are out of school. And those who have been in school are often those who are most affected by the current pandemic. We're really concerned about the impacts that Alex referred to in terms of the impact on the family. So much emphasis on supporting children to keep learning at home when parents have to work at home or when their income has been reduced. Thank you. Please go to slide 5. This is just a reminder of what the article on inclusive education of the CRPD calls for, that it calls for an inclusive education system at all levels, making sure that those with disabilities are not excluded on the basis of disability, that there's reasonable accommodation and individualized support measures. The next one, please. And an important reminder that's spelled out in General Comment 4 that was produced by the CRBD committee that distinguishes between exclusion, when students are denied access to education in any form, segregation, when students with disabilities are provided in separate environments designed for specific, for learners with specific disabilities, and isolation from students without disabilities, integration, when students with disabilities are placed in the mainstream but without any special supports, and inclusion, which is our focus, is a recognition that in order for students with disabilities to be included, educational environments have to adapt their design, their physical structures, their teaching methods, their curriculum, as well as the culture, policy, and practice of education environments, so that they're accessible to all students without discrimination. And I think where we are situated is that because of the turmoil in education systems right now, and because so many education systems are scrambling to figure out how to use their resources better, that in fact we may be able to take advantage of the opportunity to identify some of the barriers that are being highlighted by the pandemic in order to improve education systems now so that students with disabilities aren't continually disadvantaged, but also to provide for more inclusive systems going forward. And we're going to have some good support for that in a couple of weeks when the annual GEM, Global Education Monitoring Report, is issued by UNESCO, focusing on inclusion. But to focus specifically on the situation during the pandemic and what can be done now and moving towards the future, I'm going to turn this over to Asma.
Thanks, Diane. Could I have the next slide, please? So before we get into the specifics, barriers specifically related to COVID, I just want to do a really quick refresher on the different types of barriers that we know are some of the biggest hindrances that prevent children with disabilities from accessing education. And we tend to think of them in 3 large buckets. Now, the first one are institutional barriers, and these are basically your key levers that need to be addressed if you really want an inclusive education system at a systemic level. And many of these are the types of things that are increasingly difficult to change once systems are already operating. So for example, technical capacity, looking at teacher training standards or teacher training colleges. Once you have a teacher who's 5-10 years into the career, it's harder to go back and add additional knowledge. We know from experience that in-service training tends to be a little bit less effective than we would like. So thinking about things like that, that really, really can be addressed at the planning stage, at the very beginning. Similarly, with regards to inclusive budgeting and data collection systems, EMIS systems are prevalent, in most countries. However, are the majority of them also capturing data on children with disabilities? And that's another, we all know the importance of data. If children with disabilities aren't seen, they remain invisible, and it becomes increasingly difficult to ensure that their needs are being reflected in the curriculum and within the education system. The other big sort of bucket of barriers are environmental barriers. We hear this refers to things like physical infrastructure, transportation systems, school buildings, and as well as the availability of assistive devices and technology that will enable a child with a disability to actively participate on an equal basis with other children in their learning. And the third sort of bucket of barriers, and this arguably may be the hardest one to actually change, is the one around attitudinal barriers. This can be, stigma, discrimination, misconceptions about children with disabilities being incapable of learning, for example. And these are, we're talking cultural change here. We're talking mindset shifts, which can be, harder to do than building a ramp to a building or retrofitting a washroom facility, for example. But that said, it's not to say it's not possible to change these. UNICEF has done a lot of work on this, and we've seen a lot of success, and in large part, thanks to the adoption of the CRPD, but also the efforts by persons with disabilities themselves to change sort of the way people think about and process and understand disability and the rights of persons with disabilities. Can I have the next slide, please? So we all know there's no formulas for anything around disability inclusion, but the closest thing to a formula that we might have that, if there's one thing that participants take away today from this, I'm going to say it's going to be the twin track approach. And this is basically, if you can adopt this lens with regards to inclusive programming, it will come a lot closer to inclusive education. And actually across the board, not just education, but I'm going to talk about it from the education perspective. When we talk about the twin track approach, it has two streams, obviously. Both of them are equally important and necessary. The first one is looking at disability inclusion within mainstream interventions. Here we're talking about things like teacher training for universal design for learning, for example, because this is going to improve learning and opportunities for all students in addition to students with disabilities. It's not targeted only to students with disabilities. The other track of this is our disability-specific interventions, which are targeted specifically to students with disabilities and responding to their needs. And an example of this is the availability and provision of assistive technology and devices. These, assistive technology and devices range from wheelchairs to screen readers to hearing aids to communication devices and everything in between. But these are not things that you will need to distribute to the majority of students in an education system. They will be targeted, they will be specific, and they will be customized to students with disabilities. So this is an approach to keep in mind. And as Diane mentioned, for those of us in the inclusive education sector, we know that children with disabilities, even before COVID, were largely excluded and marginalized. We know that the COVID pandemic has impacted children with disabilities disproportionately. And so we're saying, let's look at this as an opportunity. This never happens. It is unheard of that, the entire education sector has had to essentially go on pause and say, okay, how do we do this? Let's all figure this out, because no one's really done this before. But it presents a great opportunity for us to say, okay, how can we actually, as Vladimir said, build back better? How can we come back and ensure that our education systems are from the foundation, responsive to the requirements of students with disabilities and compliant with the CRPD. Can we get to the next slide, please? So this is an infographic that I believe was shared with you, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically it covers the whole range of ingredients that support an inclusive education system. And if we can go on to skip slide number 10, if we can go to slide number 11, please. I'm going to get into some of the details that are more specific to the COVID pandemic. So now we know that, with the pandemic, the vast majority of learning has shifted to remote learning. There have been school closures in, I think, a majority of countries, and schools are starting, or countries are starting to assess when is safe and reasonable for them to come back, to bring children back to school, and what that will even look like. From what we've seen so far, it's probably going to be a blended learning approach where we have a mix of online remote versus in person. And we know from our school shutdown experience that the remote learning experience presented considerable challenges to inclusion. Excuse me. One of the key things that we learned was that a lot of online systems are not accessible to children with disabilities. They don't have fundamental accessibility features built into them, and then coupled with the fact that teachers often don't have the knowledge on technology as well as how to teach in an inclusive setting, it makes it even harder for children with disabilities to participate. So one of the things to really think about, again, from the opportunity perspective, is how do we strengthen our remote learning systems, our online remote learning systems particularly? How do we ensure, do we have a checklist? Can we create some sort of an accessibility guideline? And so if you look at programs like Windows, et cetera, most of them have accessibility features built in, but very few people actually know about that. So it's about looking at things like that and ensuring that accessibility features are built into these learning platforms, and coupling with that with an understanding of how children learn and what are the specific individual accommodations required for children with disabilities. The other aspect of that is also, now that for those children with disabilities who were in school before the pandemic, which we know is not at the best case estimate, it would be 1 in 2 or 1 in 3. But now that they would be learning remotely, there might be additional assistive technology needs that they would need. If a child, say a blind child was in a classroom, they may have had an assistant to support them in their learning, or they may have been using Braille materials. And now that they're home, they no longer have access to that assistant or to that additional support. And so it becomes really important for school systems to think about the assistive technology needs for students and ensure that those are available as well. And in terms of coming back, thinking about how we can strengthen these ecosystems and infrastructures to ensure that we're able to provide, whether it's supplementary materials or whether it's the actual online, digital learning. The other issue that I think has probably been one of the largest, and this is not specific to children with disabilities, but it certainly puts them at a greater disadvantage, is the issue of connectivity. We know connectivity is a huge barrier to learning for many, many children. And there's been a lot of effort and a lot of talk about let's improve and increase connectivity. We also know that children with disabilities tend to be disproportionately represented in lower income families. So it's really important to keep in mind that when connectivity measures are put in place to increase access, those are universally applied, and that they also reach those from the lowest socioeconomic bracket, so that we can facilitate learning for even the poorest children. I know I'm running out of time, but I want to make 2 more very quick points on this. The other thing, I mentioned teacher capacity development. This is new for teachers as well. This is the first time they're doing this. And so it becomes really important to also think about how we can support teachers. How do we strengthen their capacity to support learning now when it's 100% remote in some cases, but also how do we prepare them to go back into the school, into whatever blended learning situation we might be in, and give them the tools to be able to actually strengthen their ability to work with children with disabilities in an inclusive setting. And finally, for parents also, this is new, and it becomes really important to ensure that those community support mechanisms, through possibly ideally a multi-sectoral approach. So looking at things like mental health, looking at things like nutrition and food, school feeding programs, looking at rehabilitation services that might be, that children with disabilities are essential in some cases for them. And in some cases, they're reliant on the school for a lot of these support services. And how do we apply the twin track model? How do we apply this to strengthen our current systems so that when children are back in school, they have a better experience and they're more able to receive the types of supports that they need? And finally, just in terms of going back to school, I just want to highlight, you know, again, as Diane mentioned, that this really does present an opportunity to us. We know that in large part, we haven't achieved inclusive education in the way that we want to. And this sort of opportunity is unheard of. And it's actually quite exciting to say, okay, this is a golden opportunity, let's fix this. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to you, Diane. Thanks.
Thank you. As you were speaking, I was thinking back to Alex's presentation and his comments on the fact that budget cutbacks in previous years turned out to have very negative impacts and higher costs in the end. I think one of the fears that many people have is that some governments may see online learning and other forms of remote learning as cost-saving measures. You can possibly reach a larger number of students with one teacher. You don't have the infrastructure costs, but a lot of those issues are exactly the ones that put learners with disabilities in jeopardy. I'm wondering if you could comment on that, whether UNICEF is seeing that as a current risk trend, or how you think we can ensure that distance learning isn't a way of reducing costs and really leading to more exclusion.
Yeah, that's a really, excuse me, that's a really important point, because I think that fear is definitely there. So far, I can't say with any kind of confidence that we've seen this as you know, anyone thinking, oh, this is a silver bullet. This is the way we're going to cut costs, reach more students. I can't say that that's what we're seeing, but we are definitely seeing an increased affinity, if you will, for the online, you know, for online learning, and for the idea of this could become a constant part of our education experience. And as you rightly pointed out, I think it becomes really important then to say, well, what about children who are, and we talk about children with disabilities, but there are a lot more groups of children who would also be negatively impacted by that, you know, and it's such a new sort of approach to doing things that, you know, I can't even confidently say that we figured out how to run any kind of valuable assessment. Do we know if children are even learning? How do we measure participation? There are too many unknowns to really confidently say that, yeah, this is our silver bullet, this is going to fix all of our problems. And I think until, you know, I'm a teacher, so for me, I come from the perspective of nothing replaces the human interaction that comes with being in a classroom, and the social interactions, the peer-to-peer learning, the peer-to-peer, you know, socio-emotional benefits that, particularly for a lot of children with disabilities or children who come from other sorts of marginalized environments, are just as important to their development as the academic side of things. So, you know, I would definitely caution anyone who is thinking about this just might be the way to move forward to really stop and take pause and think about all of these other factors that we don't really have a lot of information about just yet.
Thank you. I think we're going to have time for only one more question, and it's not going to be an easy one for you to answer briefly. But you refer to universal design for learning, which is really seen as an approach that can both improve learning for all students in the class, but also is one that makes it possible for students, regardless of disability, to be able to participate. But for those people on the call who may not all be teachers, I wonder if you could just give us a little bit more of a description than what you did in your quick overview, and maybe give an example so that people can see that it's not magic, and that it is really possible to include learners with all kinds of different learning styles and needs in a classroom, or in even a virtual way.
Absolutely. So I think the fundamental thing about universal design for learning and the reason why it works so well is because it it affords a degree of flexibility that really a standard didactic model doesn't provide. And what I mean by that is that when teachers are applying universal design for learning in a learning instructional environment, they're really allowing students to interact and engage with the content in a way that is appropriate to their personal requirements. So if I'm a student and my teacher is presenting me with, with information, say we're doing math, for some students, they might like to hear about it, watch the teacher demonstrate something, and receive something in writing that will allow them to process it the way that they want. For another student, they might prefer something a little bit more tactile. And then, so my point here is that it provides a lot of flexibility with how students engage with material. Similarly, it also provides an equal amount of flexibility with how students demonstrate what they have learned. So again, there, and particularly for children with disabilities and children who might have, socio-emotional or communication-related difficulties, to be able to present their learning in ways that are not your standard, write an essay or, create some sort of do an oral presentation. That doesn't work for everybody. And so universal design for learning really incorporates those specific, options for students who wish to engage with content and respond to content in ways that are more suited for them. And we know that it's not just students with disabilities. It's everybody. We all have our own very specific preferences for how we learn. Imagine a world where everyone's able to engage with content in a way that works for them personally, how much more positive that learning experience might be for most learners.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the IDA team if it's possible to put our last slide on, because it does have links to other resources, or maybe you could just type the links into the chat box so that if people want other resources, they can find them, because there are a number of very valuable resources specifically for ensuring that students with disabilities aren't further disadvantaged during the pandemic. And again, a reminder that the GEM report will come out June 23rd, and also the Inclusive Education Initiative of the World Bank will be issuing a paper on inclusive education and including learners with disabilities during the pandemic, probably within the next month. So just be on the lookout for that. So thank you so much, Asma, and back to you, Vladimir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane, Asma. It was really great presentation, and really once again reminder that how important inclusive education is for learners with disabilities, and we hope that this crisis will not create some new ideas and some new solutions that will further discriminate students and put them in a more disempowered position. Indeed, let's learn something positive from this crisis and not look and not take some like negative aspects. Again, I would like to thank both of you. It was really very informative. Once again, if you can respond to the poll that is right now on your screen, this is very important for us so that we know if you would need more information or not on a certain topics. Let's now move to the third and last session of today. I will hand over to Humanity and Inclusion, Inclusive Health Policy Lead, Alessandra Aresu, who will lead us through the session on health. Please, Alessandra.
Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir, and everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm very happy to facilitate this session today. And I also wanted to highlight that this has been the topic that we are discussing here today has been an important topic in the work of IDDC and IDA in the last few weeks when it comes to discussing the effects of COVID-19 for people with disabilities. And I did so also with the head of the co-coordinator of the Inclusive Health Task Group of IDDC. Today our speaker is Dr. Alarcos Chiesa. She is the head of the Sensory Functions Disability and Rehabilitation Unit at WHO. I will give her the floor in 1 minute. I would, before giving a space to Dr. Chiesa, I would like to say that this session today for us is not only a priority because what we have been living through in the last months has started as an emergency that is fully related to health, so a health emergency. But this is also because persons with disabilities, as we have heard, have paid a very high cost, high price when it comes to access different services, and health are certainly among these services. And Dr. Chiesa will speak about this today. But I want to highlight that this has been for us also an opportunity to bring the importance of inclusive health up in the priorities of our discussions, because this pandemic has exacerbated barriers that people with disabilities have been facing when it comes to access health services that predate COVID-19, that have been there before, and that we are now discussing from the perspective of COVID-19 and the build back better. I will now leave the floor to Alarcos, and thank you, all of you, for being with us today.
Thank you, Alessandra. And I also would like to thank Vladimir and both of you really representing IDA and IDDC for giving me the opportunity to take the floor in this forum. I'm really pleased, and it is a great honor. And I also would like to thank both organizations, IDA and IDDC, really for the support that you have provided also to WHO through challenging also WHO to take the agenda of disability and persons with disabilities seriously throughout the response. So I really wanted to use this opportunity to publicly thank both organizations and you both as representatives of it. And we have been discussing the COVID-19 in two different phases up to now, talking about the response phase and the recovery phase. And I would like to touch both of them from the perspective of health. And if we start with the health with the response phase, I could like to emphasize that recommendation that WHO has been giving from the beginning, and also to which most or the many, I would say, many member states or many countries had been adhering to. And it is this recommendation of having a whole government approach when responding to COVID-19. And there has been also guidance provided from WHO how to address or how to take on this whole government approach in terms of the response of COVID-19. And countries have been developing action plans for the response. And these are action plans at the national level or subnational level. And the point that, and why I mentioned this whole government approach, these action plans, is because one of the most important recommendations that we need to be taken into consideration when including persons with disabilities in this in the response to COVID-19 is to make sure that the agenda of disability and the agenda of persons with disabilities is included in these action plans, that is included in the action plan of the response of COVID-19 and in this whole government approach. Because if you are part of this whole government approach, you will, or if persons with disabilities and disabilities included in this whole government approach planning the response, then the actions that will follow will also include persons with disabilities. And we have seen examples of some countries that have, where it has made a fundamental difference when the agenda of disability and persons with disabilities have been included from the beginning, from the outset, and also when, unfortunately, at the beginning was not like that, but then thanks to the advocacy that is fundamental, then in some cases has been an inclusion a little bit later, but still having fundamental effects. Unfortunately, still in many countries, we see that that is not the case, and that is the first call to all of you is when moving forward, a request from an advocacy point of view, a request to include the agenda of disability in the action plans and in the whole government approach of the response to COVID-19. Then what are the actions that need to be included in this response? And again, ideally, after having already planned from the outset that the agenda of disability is included in the response, and if not, what are the actions that we need to advocate for? And these actions in the response phase correspond to three different increased risk that we know persons with disabilities are exposed to during COVID-19. The first risk is an increased risk of getting the disease, and that is the first risk. The second risk is the risk of, once you get the disease, of developing severe symptoms or severe cases of COVID-19 and an increased risk of dying associated to COVID-19. And the third risk is, even if COVID-19 has, even if COVID-19 has not been got, or the disease is not present, then an increased risk for persons with disabilities of have a deteriorated health in the process of the pandemic, and even when we come out of the pandemic. So what are the actions that would help to address these three different increased risks? If we look at the increased risk of getting the disease, why it is the case? And this is the case because, and actually this has two different components, because first of all, what we do in order to prevent that people get the disease and get COVID-19 is provide information. What are the measures that need to be taken in order to prevent that I get the disease? And if this information with which I communicate what I need to do in order to prevent that I have the disease is not accessible to persons with disabilities, then there is a risk there that I don't know what I need to do in order to prevent getting the disease. So it is fundamental that whatever public health information is provided to the population to prevent the disease is provided in accessible formats, is provided in it is provided in easy to read language, that it is provided with means of accessibility for persons with hearing impairment, for persons with vision impairment, and so on and so forth. And that we have seen that it has not been the case in many countries of the world. The second is you recommend certain actions, or that from a public health perspective, we recommend certain actions that need to be put into practice. In the case of persons with disabilities, there is often certain difficulties to implement those actions. For that reasons, we need to make sure that from a public health perspective, accommodations are provided so that those public health actions can be put in place. For example, if in some countries we have seen that facilities have been created for hygiene and hand washing, we need to make sure that these public health interventions and public health initiatives also are accessible and adapt to the requirements of persons with disabilities. Or for example, in the case of measures that require physical distancing, when we know that in many cases for persons with disabilities is impossible if you need a personal assistant to really maintain the physical distance that is very often required, then we need to make sure that exceptions and accommodations are provided so that other safety measures can be implemented by persons with disabilities themselves or by the personal assistant, making sure that the provision of toolkit or the kits for preventing the transmission of the disease are provided to assistants and persons with disabilities. We have seen in some countries examples of this, but unfortunately also in many countries still those are not put into place. Let me now go to the actions that need to be put in place in order to avoid the second increased risk. The increased risk of once a person with disability has got the disease, has got COVID-19, to how we can address that, the issue of developing most severe symptoms of COVID-19 and even to dying from COVID-19. And the first thing is, once persons with disabilities have got the disease, we need to make sure that accommodations are done so that there is an immediate access to health services. The health services in order to obtain the required treatment. And this would imply that it needs to be facilitated, the access to transportations to the health facility, it needs to be facilitated also the access to adequate examination procedures and tests, but also there is a need to make sure that health professionals are sensitive to the requirements of persons with disabilities, and also to behave and to adopt a treatment that address the human rights requirements that are needed. And there is another component that has led to an increased risk of persons with disabilities of developing severe symptoms and even to die as the consequences of COVID-19. And that has been the case that we have seen very frequently in the news, that people or persons with disabilities, unfortunately, frequently have been denied the health care needed because of triaging practice, where decisions about the resource allocation needed to be taken. And of course, this is due to to the fact that health system has become overburdened in the efforts to provide care to large numbers of people, and particularly when countries have faced limited supplies of resources, such as, for example, ventilators. What we need to make sure, and what need to be requested, is that decisions regarding triage, and in the context where this is needed, this is implemented following ethical principles and ethical values that are necessary to implement, that for which WHO has been also providing guidance. So there are values and principles in terms of transparency, in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of consistency, and in terms of accountability. Now I would like to go to the actions related to the third increased risk. I said it is an increased risk at the beginning of getting the disease, getting COVID-19, an increased risk of developing severe symptoms or even from dying from the disease. And the third one is, even if one does not suffer or does not get the disease, then there is an increase to experience deteriorated health due to the consequences of the public health measures that are taking place. One of these public health measures that has been put in place, and it was necessary in many cases in order to avoid the transmission, was lockdowns and having to stay at home. This lead very frequently to actually not being able to fulfill or to have healthy behaviors in terms of physical activity or eat appropriately or in a healthy manner. So they are, and due to very often to the health condition underlying to the disability, persons with disabilities have an increased risk of getting more deteriorated health if these health-related behaviors cannot be put into place. For that reason, what it is necessary also is accommodate and make sure that when campaigns, public health campaigns, or when healthy behaviors are promoted in terms of physical activities, all of those are made accessible and options are provided so that persons with disabilities have also access to them. Another public health measure that has been put into place in many countries in order to avoid the transmission has been reducing the number of health services that has been provided and reduce those to the minimum. The challenge is that the health services that are considered necessary and essential for the general population are not sufficient for persons with disabilities, or those services that are not considered essential for the general population are essential for many persons with disabilities. Let me mention, for example, rehabilitation services for some children with neurodevelopmental disability. It can have tremendous negative consequences not being able to receive rehabilitation for a period of 2 or 3 months. So what we need to make sure that mechanisms are put in place so that access to services like rehabilitation services and assistive technology services are accessible to persons with disabilities, even in situation of lockdowns. In some countries, some measures have, like trying to triage through telehealth has been put into place with more or less success, but we need to make sure that more of these measures of making exceptions for persons with disabilities for receiving essential services for persons with disabilities are put into place. And all these different actions are again with the primary objective of reducing those increased risks that we know persons with disabilities are exposed to during the COVID-19 health emergency, and that we have been seeing in many countries. And again, if the disability agenda is part of the strategic plan of the response, we can say with confidence that those measures are put on. We increase also the probability that those measures are put in place. And that, for that reason, is so necessary to advocate for including the agenda of disability in the strategic plans for the response to COVID-19. Now, if we go into the recovery phase, and we really need to start thinking tremendously in the recovery phase and what we will propose as essential actions in the recovery phase. And because we need already to plan for it, so that we make sure that when the next pandemic arrive, and it will come at some point, situations of public health emergencies of this kind, we are not confronted with the same situation that we have been confronted at this point. And what we need to make sure is that, again, that persons with disabilities and the disability agenda are taken into consideration in the strategic plans that are being put in place for the recovery phase. And this has been also requested by the World Health Assembly resolution on COVID-19 that was discussed and endorsed by member states in the last World Health Assembly a couple of weeks ago. We need to use this resolution in order to make sure that persons with disabilities and the disability agenda is included in the recovery phase, to make sure that health systems are inclusive of persons with disabilities. And actually, I would stop at this point because I realized that it is almost the time over, and I could have talked a little bit more about the recovery phase, but I think I need to stop at this point. I think, again, the message is we need to make sure that in the plans of the recovery phase, the disability agenda is included, so that persons with disabilities are also included in the actions. Thank you. Back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Alarcos, for your presentation. And it is true, time is against us, but I think that the richness of your presentation pays back for the few minutes less we will have for questions. Just to summarize a couple of points that you have made for our audience there, you have identified three very key important principles of accessibility, non-discrimination, and participation when it comes to access to services, health services, but also overall when it comes to strategically respond to COVID-19, making sure that everybody receive the services and the support needed, and first of all, persons with disabilities. These three principles are the core principles of inclusive health, are not new to us. If our audience that are all government officials are familiar with the UNCRPD, the UN Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities, and I'm sure they are, they will find this principles throughout the convention, but certainly in Article 25 of the CRPD that focus specifically on inclusive health. That summarize a little bit what we have said for today in the emergency of COVID-19 and for the future. And I'm sure our audience is familiar with it because up to today, if my numbers are fully updated, the CRPD has been signed by 177 countries. So in your work, you are not fully familiar with this convention. My recommendation, our recommendation is really to go back to it and be inspired for the next actions that you are taking. The second important point that Alarcos made and is the importance of the response and the future steps that we are going to make in relation to COVID-19, but certainly to build better. And I would like to add there that it is not only building better, but being better prepared for future emergencies, because unfortunately we are more and more exposed to emergencies and of any type, and sometimes the emergencies comes together. So now is the hurricane season in some part of the world, and COVID-19 overlaps with other emergencies. So what you have learned today through Alarcos' words is helpful not only to COVID-19, but to better prepare your governments for future emergencies. Now we have very little time, but I would like to ask one question to Alarcos before letting her go, which is related to the essential services that often are, and the needs that often are highly needed by a specific group of persons with disabilities that are women and girls. Also because we know that many of the governments that are represented today are very careful and very proactive in promoting the rights of women and girls in general, and certainly the rights on sexual and reproductive health and actions that are aiming to prevent gender-based violence, which is an important topic when discussing COVID-19. Unfortunately, we only have a very short time, but I think it would be helpful to hear your voice on this specific point. And of course, if more question comes, we will be able to maybe respond to the audience offline, if that is. Thank you, Alarcos.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I understand your question in terms of health, of sexual and reproductive health, and the extent to which those services are considered as essential services or not.
We assume, because this is the understanding of many in the discussion, that these are essential. These are
exactly.
Yes. Yeah. But often persons with disabilities have already facing barriers to access them. And how do you see the action of our participants in the audience that could take even forward the intersectionality between gender and disability when it comes to essential services and COVID-19?
And I think that is really what accentuates the importance of building back better. And really make sure, as you said, that women with disabilities have experienced frequently still barriers, unfortunately, to access to sexual and reproductive health. And it is really a requirement and a mandate when we come back and when we address and when we plan the recovery phase, that we address those barriers in a systematic manner and really from a health system perspective. And I think that is the step that we need really to include as part of the recovery phase.
Thank you. Thank you, Alarcos. And we have one additional message in the chat that highlight that addressing gender-based violence is essential, just to strengthen even further what you have just said. I conclude saying thank you to you. and to our audience, but also to remind our audience that you should have received 2 documents from the organizers that are some key points that IDDC and IDA have worked on when it comes to the recent resolution, WHO resolution on COVID-19 response. They can guide your action in making sure that you keep in mind the needs of persons with disabilities at every step of the way, and you ensure that the participation of persons with disabilities and organizations that work to support the rights of persons with disabilities are with you every step of the way. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, and thank you very much, Arakos, for a very important presentation. We don't have much time now left. I would really like to thank you very much. Also, from my 3-year-old daughter, she said that you have a beautiful painting in the back. I would agree. I think you have the best background. I'm doing these webinars all the time, but I think this is the best background that I have seen. With those words, I really believe that this was an important webinar and this session on health as well. And I believe that we learn all a lot from presenters. Like I said, we will put this presentation online so that we can revisit. Also, I will thank presenters for being available for any further questions that may come. And I would like to once again invite audience to complete the poll that is now on your screen, and to thank you once again for coming to this webinar. Thank you very much, and I hope that you will have a nice day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.